The Spectre Bridegroom by Washington Irving. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito, Crasto. The Spectre Bridegroom by Washington Irving. He that supper for is dight. He lies full cold, I trow, this night. Yestreen to chamber I him led. This night Greysteel has made his bed. Sir Edgar, Sir Graham, and Sir Greysteel. On the summit of one of the heights of the Odenwald, a wild and romantic tract of Upper Germany that lies not far from the confluence of the Main and the Rhine, there stood many, many years since the castle of the Baron von Landshut. It is now quite fallen to decay, and almost buried among beech trees and dark firs, about which, however, its old watch-tower may still be seen, struggling, like the former possessor I have mentioned, to carry a high head and look down upon the neighbouring country. The Baron was a dry branch of the great family of the Katzenelnbogen, and inherited the relics of the property, and all the pride of his ancestors. Though the warlike disposition of his predecessors had much impaired the family possessions, yet the Baron still endeavoured to keep up some show of former state. The times were peaceable, and the German nobles in general had abandoned their inconvenient old castles, perched like eagles' nests among the mountains, and had built more convenient residences in the valleys. Still the Baron remained proudly drawn up in his little fortress, cherishing, with hereditary inveteracy, all the old family feuds, so that he was on ill terms with some of his nearest neighbours, on account of disputes that had happened between their great-great-grandfathers. That is, Cat's Elbow, the name of a family of those parts very powerful in former times. The appellation, we are told, was given in compliment to a peerless dame of the family, celebrated for her fine arm. The Baron had but one child, a daughter, but nature, when she grants but one child, always compensates by making it a prodigy, and so it was with the daughter of the Baron. All the nurses, gossips, and country cousins assured her father that she had not her equal for beauty in all Germany. And who should know better than they? She had, moreover, been brought up with great care, under the superintendence of two maiden aunts, who had spent some years of their early life at one of the little German courts, and was skilled in all the branches of knowledge necessary to the education of a fine lady. Under their instructions she became a miracle of accomplishments. By the time she was 18, she could embroider to admiration, and had worked whole histories of the saints in tapestry, with such strength of expression in their countenances that they looked like so many souls in purgatory. She could read without great difficulty, and had spelled her way through several church legends, and almost all the chivalric wonders of the Heldenbuch. She had even made considerable proficiency in writing, could sign her own name without missing a letter, and so legibly that her aunts could read it without spectacles. She excelled in making little elegant good-for-nothing ladylike knick-knacks of all kinds, was versed in the most abstruse dancing of the day, played a number of airs on the harp and guitar, and knew all the tender ballads of the meaner Lieder by heart. Her aunts, too, having been great flirts and coquettes in their younger days, were admirably calculated to be vigilant guardians and strict censors of the conduct of their niece, for there is no duenna so rigidly prudent and inexorably decorous as a superannuated coquette. She was rarely suffered out of their sight, never went beyond the domains of the castle, unless well attended, or rather well watched, had continual lectures read to her about strict decorum and implicit obedience, and as to the men, pah! She was taught to hold them at such a distance, and in such absolute distrust, that, unless properly authorized, she would not have cast a glance upon the handsomest cavalier in the world, no, not if he were even dying at her feet. The good effects of this system were wonderfully apparent. The young lady was a pattern of docility and correctness, while others were wasting their sweetness in the glare of the world, and liable to be plucked and thrown aside by every hand. She was coyly blooming into fresh and lovely womanhood under the protection of those immaculate spinsters, like a rosebud blushing forth among guardian thorns. Her aunts looked upon her with pride and exultation, and vaunted that though all the other young ladies in the world might go astray, yet, thank heaven, nothing of the kind could happen to the heiress of the Katzenelnbogen. But however scantily the Baron von Landshut might be provided with children, his household was by no means a small one, for Providence had enriched him with abundance of poor relations. They, one and all, possessed the affectionate disposition common to humble relatives, were wonderfully attached to the baron, and took every possible occasion to come in swarms and enliven the castle. All family festivals were commemorated by these good people at the baron's expense, and when they were filled with good cheer, they would declare that there was nothing on earth so delightful as these family meetings, these jubilees of the heart. The baron, though a small man, had a large soul, and it swelled with satisfaction at the consciousness of being the greatest man in the little world about him. He loved to tell long stories about the dark old warriors whose portraits looked grimly down from the walls around, and he found no listeners equal to those who fed at his expense. He was much given to the marvellous, and a firm believer in all those supernatural tales with which every mountain and valley in Germany abounds. The faith of his guests exceeded even his own. They listened to every tale of wonder with open eyes and mouth, and never failed to be astonished, even though repeated for the 100th time. Thus lived the Baron von Landshut, the oracle of his table, the absolute monarch of his little territory, and happy, above all things, in the persuasion that he was the wisest man of the age. At the time of which my story treats, there was a great family gathering at the castle, on an affair of the utmost importance. It was to receive the destined bridegroom of the baron's daughter. A negotiation had been carried on between the father and an old nobleman of Bavaria to unite the dignity of their houses by the marriage of their children. The preliminaries had been conducted with proper punctilio. The young people were betrothed without seeing each other, and the time was appointed for the marriage ceremony. The Count von Altenburg had been recalled from the army for the purpose, and was actually on his way to the baron's to receive his bride. Missives had even been received from him from Würzburg, where he was accidentally detained, mentioning the day and hour when he might be expected to arrive. The castle was in a tumult of preparation to give him a suitable welcome. The fair bride had been decked out with uncommon care. The two aunts had superintended her toilet and quarrelled the whole morning about every article of her dress. The young lady had taken advantage of their contest to follow the bent of her own taste, and fortunately it was a good one. She looked so lovely as youthful bridegroom could desire, and the flutter of expectation heightened the lustre of her charms. The suffusions that mantled her face and neck, the gentle heaving of the bosom, the eye now and then lost in reverie, all betrayed the soft tumult that was going on in her little heart. The aunts were continually hovering around her, for maiden aunts are apt to take great interest in affairs of this nature. They were giving her a world of state counsel how to deport herself, what to say, and in what manner to receive the expected lover. The baron was no less busied in preparations. He had in truth nothing exactly to do, but he was naturally a fuming, bustling little man, and he could not remain passive when all the world was in a hurry. He worried from top to bottom of the castle with an air of infinite anxiety. He continually called the servants from their work to exhort them to be diligent, and buzzed about every hall and chamber, as idly restless and importunate as a blue-bottle fly on a warm summer's day. In the meantime the fatted calf had been killed, the clamour of the huntsman, the kitchen was crowded with good cheer, the cellars had yielded up whole oceans of Rhine wine and Furner wine, and even the great Heidelberg Tun had been laid under contribution. Everything was ready to receive the distinguished guest with sows and brows in the true spirit of German hospitality, but the guest delayed to make his appearance. Hour rolled after hour. The sun that had poured his downward rays upon the rich forest of the Odenwald now just gleamed among the summits of the mountains. The baron mounted the highest tower, and strained his eyes in hope of catching a distant sight of the Count and his attendants. Once he thought he beheld them. The sound of horns came floating from the valley, prolonged by the mountain echoes. A number of horsemen were seen far below, slowly advancing along the road, but when they had nearly reached the foot of the mountain, they suddenly struck off in a different direction. The last ray of sunshine departed, the bats began to flit by in the twilight, the road grew dimmer and dimmer to the view, and nothing appeared stirring in it but now and then a peasant lagging homeward from his labour. While the old castle of Landshut was in this state of perplexity, a very interesting scene was transacting in a different part of the Odenwald. The young Count von Altenburg was tranquilly pursuing his route in that sober jog-trot way in which a man travels toward matrimony when his friends have taken all the trouble and uncertainty of courtship off his hands, and a bride is waiting for him, as certainly as a dinner at the end of his journey. He had encountered at Würzburg a youthful companion in arms, with whom he had seen some service on the frontiers, Hermann von Stockenfaust, one of the stoutest hands and worthiest hearts of German chivalry, who was now returning from the army. His father's castle was not far distant from the old fortress of Landshut, although an hereditary feud rendered the families hostile and strangers to each other. In the warm-hearted moment of recognition, the young friends related all their past adventures and fortunes, and the Count gave the whole history of his intended nuptials with a young lady whom he had never seen, but of whose charms he had received the most enrapturing description. As the route of the friends lay in the same direction, they agreed to perform the rest of their journey together, and, that they might do it the most leisurely, set off from Würzburg at an early hour, the Count having given directions of his retinue to follow and overtake him. They beguiled their wayfaring with recollections of their military scenes and adventures, but the Count was apt to be a little tedious, now and then, about the reputed charms of his bride and the felicity that awaited him. In this way they had entered among the mountains of the Odenwald, and were traversing one of its most lonely and thickly wooded passes. It is well known that the forests of Germany have always been as much infested by robbers as its castle by spectres, and at this time the former were particularly numerous, from the hordes of the disbanded soldiers wandering about the country. It will not appear extraordinary, therefore, that the cavaliers were attacked by a gang of these stragglers in the midst of the forest. They defended themselves with bravery, but were nearly overpowered when the Count's retinue arrived to their assistance. At the sight of them the robbers fled, but not until the Count had received a mortal wound. He was slowly and carefully conveyed back to the city of Würzburg, and a friar, summoned from a neighbouring convent, who was famous for his skill in administering to both soul and body, but half of his skill was superfluous. The moments of the unfortunate Count were numbered. With his dying breath he entreated his friend to repair instantly to the castle of Landshut and explain the fatal cause of his not keeping his appointment with his bride. Though not the most ardent of lovers, he was one of the most punctilious of men, and appeared earnestly solicitous that his mission should be speedily and courteously executed. "Unless this is done," said he, "I shall not sleep quietly in my grave." He repeated these last words with peculiar solemnity. A request at a moment so impressive admitted no hesitation. Stockenfaust endeavoured to soothe him to calmness, promised faithfully to execute his wish, and gave him his hand in solemn pledge. The dying man pressed it in acknowledgment, but soon lapsed into delirium, raved about his bride, his engagements, his plighted word, ordered his horse that he might ride to the castle of Landshut, and expired in the fancied act of vaulting into the saddle. Stockenfaust bestowed a sigh and a soldier's tear on the untimely fate of his comrade, and then pondered on the awkward mission he had undertaken. His heart was heavy, and his head perplexed, for he was to present himself an unbidden guest among hostile people, and to damp their festivity with tidings fatal to their hopes. Still there were certain whisperings of curiosity in his bosom to see this far-famed beauty of Katzenelnbogen, so cautiously shut up from the world, for he was a passionate admirer of the sex, and there was a dash of eccentricity and enterprise in his character that made him fond of all singular adventure. Previous to his departure he made all due arrangements with the holy fraternity of the convent for the funeral solemnities of his friend, who was to be buried in the cathedral of Würzburg, near some of his illustrious relatives, and the mourning retinue of the Count took charge of his remains. It is now high time that we should return to the ancient family of Katzenelnbogen, who were impatient for their guest, and still more for their dinner, and to the worthy little baron whom we left airing himself on the watch-tower. Night closed in, but still no guest arrived. The baron descended from the tower in despair. The banquet, which had been delayed from hour to hour, could no longer be postponed. The meats were already overdone, the cook in an agony, and the whole household had the look of a garrison that had been reduced by famine. The baron was obliged reluctantly to give orders for the feast without the presence of the guest. All were seated at table, and just on the point of commencing, when the sound of a horn from without the gate gave notice of the approach of a stranger. Another long blast filled the old courts of the castle with its echoes, and was answered by the warder from the walls. The baron hastened to receive his future son-in-law. The drawbridge had been let down, and the stranger was before the gate. He was a tall, gallant cavalier, mounted on a black steed. His countenance was pale, but he had a beaming, romantic eye, and an air of stately melancholy. The baron was a little mortified that he should have come in this simple, solitary style. His dignity for a moment was ruffled, and he felt disposed to consider it a want of proper respect for the important occasion and the important family with which he was to be connected. He pacified himself, however, with the conclusion that it must have been youthful impatience which had induced him thus to spur on sooner than his attendants. "I am sorry," said the stranger, "to break in upon you thus unseasonably." Here the baron interrupted him with a world of compliments and greetings, for, to tell the truth, he prided himself upon his courtesy and eloquence. The stranger attempted once or twice to stem the torrent of the words, but in vain, for he bowed his head and suffered it to flow on. By the time the baron had come to a pause, they had reached the inner court of the castle, and the stranger was again about to speak, when he was once more interrupted by the appearance of the female part of the family, leading forth the shrinking and blushing bride. He gazed on her for a moment as one entranced. It seemed as if his whole soul beamed forth in the gaze, and rested upon that lovely form. One of the maiden aunts whispered something in her ear. She made an effort to speak. Her moist blue eyes were timidly raised, gave a shy glance of inquiry on the stranger, and was cast again to the ground. The words died away, but there was a sweet smile playing upon her lips, and a soft dimpling of the cheek that showed her glance had not been unsatisfactory. It was impossible for a girl of the fond age of 18, highly predisposed for love and matrimony, not to be pleased with so gallant a cavalier. The late hour at which the guest had arrived left no time for parley. The baron was peremptory, and deferred all particular conversation until the morning, and led the way to the untasted banquet. It was served up in the great hall of the castle. Around the walls hung the hard-favoured portraits of the heroes of the house of Katzenelnbogen, and the trophies which they had gained in the field and in the chase. Hacked corslets, splintered jousting spears, and tattered banners were mingled with the spoils of sylvan warfare. The jaws of the wolf and the tusks of the boar grinned horribly among the crossbows and battle-axes, and a huge pair of antlers branched immediately over the head of the youthful bridegroom. The cavalier took but little notice of the company or the entertainment. He scarcely tasted the banquet, but seemed absorbed in the admiration of his bride. He conversed in a low tone that could not be overheard, for the language of love is never loud. But where is the female ear so dull that it cannot catch the softest whisper of the lover? There was a mingled tenderness and gravity in his manner that appeared to have a powerful effect upon the young lady. Her colour came and went as she listened with deep attention. Now and then she made some blushing reply, and when his eyes were turned away, she would steal a sidelong glance at his romantic countenance, and heave a gentle sigh of tender happiness. It was evident that the young couple were completely enamoured. The aunts, who were deeply versed in the mysteries of the heart, declared that they had fallen in love with each other at first sight. The feast went on merrily, or at least noisily, for the guests were all blessed with those keen appetites that attend upon light purses and mountain air. The baron told his best and longest stories, and never had told them so well or with such great effect. If there was anything marvellous, his auditors were lost in astonishment, and if anything facetious, they were sure to laugh exactly in the right places. The baron, it is true, like most great men, was too dignified to utter any joke but a dull one. It was always enforced, however, by a bumper of excellent Hochheimer, and even a dull joke at one's own table, served up with jolly old wine, is irresistible. Many good things were said by poorer and keener wits that would not bear repeating except on similar occasions. Many sly speeches whispered in the ladies' ears that almost convulsed them with suppressed laughter, and a song or two roared out by a poor but merry and broad-faced cousin of the baron that absolutely made the maiden aunts hold up their fans. Amidst all this revelry, the stranger guest maintained a most singular and unseasonable gravity. His countenance assumed a deeper cast of dejection as the evening advanced, and strange as it may appear, even the baron's jokes seemed only to render him the more melancholy. At times he was lost in thought, and at times there was a perturbed and restless wandering of the eyes that bespoke a mind but ill at ease. His conversations with the bride became more and more earnest and mysterious. Lowering clouds began to steal over the fair serenity of her brow, and tremors to run through her tender frame. All this could not escape the notice of the company. Their gaiety was chilled by the unaccountable gloom of the bridegroom. Their spirits were infected. Whispers and glances were interchanged, accompanied by shrugs and dubious shakes of the head. The song and the laugh grew less and less frequent. There were dreary pauses in the conversation, which were at length succeeded by wild tales and supernatural legends. One dismal story produced another still more dismal, and the baron nearly frightened some of the ladies into hysterics with the history of the goblin horseman that carried away the fair Leonora, a dreadful story which has since been put into excellent verse and is read and believed by all the world. The bridegroom listened to this tale with profound attention. He kept his eyes steadily fixed on the baron, and as the story drew to a close, began gradually to rise from his seat, growing taller and taller, until in the baron's entranced eye he seemed almost to tower into a giant. The moment the tale was finished, he heaved a deep sigh, and took a solemn farewell of the company. They were all amazement. The baron was perfectly thunderstruck. What? Going to leave the castle at midnight? Why, everything was prepared for this reception. A chamber was ready for him if he wished to retire. The stranger shook his head mournfully and mysteriously. I must lay my head in a different chamber to-night. There was something in this reply, and the tone in which it was uttered, that made the baron's heart misgive him, but he rallied his forces and repeated his hospitable entreaties. The stranger shook his head silently, but positively, at every offer, and waving his farewell to the company, stalked slowly out of the hall. The maiden aunts were absolutely petrified. The bride hung her head, and a tear stole to her eye. The baron followed the stranger to the great court of the castle, where the black charger stood pawing the earth and snorting with impatience. When they had reached the portal, whose deep archway was dimly lighted by a cresset, the stranger paused, and addressed the baron in a hollow tone of voice, which the vaulted roof rendered still more sepulchral. Now that we are alone, said he, I will impart to you the reason of my going. I have a solemn and indispensable engagement. Why, said the baron, cannot you send someone in your place? It admits of no substitute. I must attend it in person. I must away to Würzburg Cathedral. Ay, said the baron, plucking up spirit, but not until tomorrow. Tomorrow you shall take your bride there. No, no, replied the stranger with tenfold solemnity. My engagement is with no bride. The worms expect me. I am a dead man. I have been slain by robbers. My body lies at Würzburg at midnight. I am to be buried. The grave is waiting for me. I must keep my appointment. He sprang on his black charger, dashed over the drawbridge, and the clattering of his horse's hoofs was lost in the whistling of the night blast. The baron returned to the hall in the utmost consternation, and related what had passed. 2 ladies fainted outright. Others sickened at the idea of having banqueted with a spectre. It was the opinion of some that this might be the wild huntsman, famous in German legend. Some talked of mountain sprites, of wood demons, and of other supernatural beings with which the good people of Germany have been so grievously harassed since time immemorial. One of the poor relations ventured to suggest that it might be some sportive evasion of the young cavalier, and that the very gloominess of the caprice seemed to accord with so melancholy a personage. This, however, drew on him that the indignation of the whole company, and especially of the baron, who looked upon him as little better than an infidel, so that he was fain to abjure his heresy as speedily as possible, and come into the faith of the true believers. But whatever may have been the doubts entertained, they were completely put to an end by the arrival next day of regular missives, confirming the intelligence of the young count's murder and his interment in Würzburg Cathedral. The dismay at the castle may well be imagined. The baron shut himself up in his chamber. The guests who had come to rejoice with him could not think of abandoning him in his distress. They wandered about the courts or collected in groups in the hall, shaking their heads and shrugging their shoulders at the troubles of so good a man, and sat longer than ever at table, and ate and drank more stoutly than ever, by way of keeping up their spirits. But the situation of the widowed bride was the most pitiable. To have lost a husband before she had even embraced him, and such a husband! If the very spectre could be so gracious and noble, what must have been the living man? She filled the house with lamentations. On the night of the 2nd day of her widowhood, she had retired to her chamber, accompanied by one of her aunts, who insisted on sleeping with her. The aunt, who was one of the best tellers of ghost stories in all Germany, had just been recounting one of her longest, and had fallen asleep in the very midst of it. The chamber was remote and overlooked a small garden. The niece lay pensively gazing at the beams of the rising moon as they trembled on the leaves of an aspen tree before the lattice. The castle clock had just tolled midnight, when a soft strain of music stole up from the garden. She rose hastily from her bed and stepped lightly to the window. A tall figure stood among the shadows of the trees. As it raised its head, a beam of moonlight fell upon the countenance. heaven and earth, she beheld the spectre bridegroom. A loud shriek at that moment burst upon her ear, and her aunt, who had been awakened by the music, and had followed her silently to the window, fell into her arms. When she looked again, the spectre had disappeared. Of the two females, the aunt now required the most soothing, for she was perfectly beside herself with terror. As to the young lady, there was something even in the spectre of her lover that seemed endearing. There was still the semblance of manly beauty, and though the shadow of a man is but little calculated to satisfy the affection of a lovesick girl, yet, where the substance is not to be had, even that is consoling. The aunt declared she would never sleep in that chamber again. The niece, for once, was refractory, and declared as strongly that she would sleep in no other in the castle. The consequence was that she had to sleep in it alone. But she drew a promise from her aunt not to relate the story of the spectre, lest she should be denied the only melancholy pleasure left her on earth, that of inhabiting the chamber over which the guardian shade of her lover kept its nightly vigils. How long the good old lady would have observed this promise is uncertain, for she dearly loved to talk of the marvellous, and there is a triumph in being the first to tell a frightful story. It is, however, still quoted in the neighbourhood as a memorable instance of female secrecy, that she kept it to herself for a whole week, when she was suddenly absolved from all further restraint by intelligence brought to the breakfast table one morning that the young lady was not to be found. Her room was empty, the bed had not been slept in, the window was open, and the bird had flown. The astonishment and concern with which the intelligence was received can only be imagined by those who have witnessed the agitation which the mishaps of a great man cause among his friends. Even the poor relations paused for a moment from the indefatigable labours of the trencher, when the aunt, who had at first been struck speechless, wrung her hands and shrieked out, "The goblin! The goblin! She's carried away by the goblin!" In a few words she related the fearful scene of the garden, and concluded that the spectre must have carried off his bride. Two of the domestics corroborated the opinion, for they had heard the clattering of a horse's hoofs down the mountain about midnight, and had no doubt that it was the spectre on his black charger, bearing her away to the tomb. All present were struck with the direful probability, for events of the kind are extremely common in Germany, as many well authenticated histories bear witness. What a lamentable situation was that of the poor baron! What a heart-rending dilemma for a fond father, and a member of the great family of Katzenelnbogen! His only daughter had either been rapt away to the grave, or he was to have some wood demon for a son-in-law, and perchance a troop of goblin grandchildren. As usual, he was completely bewildered, and all the castle in an uproar. The men were ordered to take horse and scour every road and path and glen of the Odenwald. The baron himself had just drawn on his jack-boots, girded on his sword, and was about to mount his steed to sally forth on the doubtful quest, when he was brought to a pause by a new apparition. A lady was seen approaching the castle, mounted on a palfrey, attended by a cavalier on horseback. She galloped up to the gate, sprang from her horse, and falling at the baron's feet, embraced his knees. It was his lost daughter, and her companion, the spectre bridegroom. The baron was astounded. He looked at his daughter, then at the spectre, and almost doubted the evidence of his senses. The latter, too, was wonderfully improved in his appearance since his visit to the world of spirits. His dress was splendid, and set off a noble figure of manly symmetry. He was no longer pale and melancholy. His fine countenance was flushed with the glow of youth, and joy rioted in his large dark eyes. The mystery was soon cleared up. The cavalier, for in truth, as you must have known all the while, he was no goblin, announced himself as Sir Hermann von Starkenfaust. He related his adventure with the young count. He told how he had hastened to the castle to deliver the unwelcome tidings, but that the eloquence of the baron had interrupted him in every attempt to tell his tale. How the sight of the bride had completely captivated him, and that to pass a few hours near her he had tacitly suffered the mistake to continue. How he had been sorely perplexed in what way to make a decent retreat, until the baron's goblin stories had suggested his eccentric exit. Now, fearing the feudal hostility of the family, he had repeated his visits by stealth, had haunted the garden beneath the young lady's window, had won, had borne away in triumph, and, in a word, had wedded the fair. Under any other circumstances the baron would have been inflexible, for he was tenacious of paternal authority, and devoutly obstinate in all family feuds. But he loved his daughter. He had lamented her as lost. He rejoiced to find her still alive, and though her husband was of a hostile house, yet, thank heaven, he was not a goblin. There was something, it must be acknowledged, that did not exactly accord with his notion of strict veracity, in the joke the night had passed upon him of being a dead man. But several old friends present, who had served in the wars, assured him that every stratagem was excusable in love, and that the cavalier was entitled to a special privilege, having lately served as a trooper. Matters therefore were happily arranged. The baron pardoned the young couple on the spot. The revels at the castle were resumed. The poor relations overwhelmed this new member of the family with loving kindness. He was so gallant, so generous, and so rich. The aunts, it is true, were somewhat scandalized that their system of strict seclusion and passive obedience should be so badly exemplified, but attributed it to all their negligence in not having the windows grated. One of them was particularly mortified at having her marvellous story marred, and that the only spectre she had ever seen should turn out to be a counterfeit. But the niece seemed perfectly happy at having found him substantial flesh and blood. And so the story ends. End of The End, the Sketchbook, The Spectre Bridegroom, A Traveller's Tale, by Washington Irving. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. The Severed Hand, by Wilhelm Hauff. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Severed Hand, by William Hauff. I was born in Constantinople. My father was a dragoman at the port, and besides carried on a fairly lucrative business in sweet-scented perfumes and silk goods. He gave me a good education. He partly instructed me himself, and also had me instructed by one of our priests. He had first intended me to succeed him in business one day, but as I showed greater aptitude than he had expected, he destined me, on the advice of his friends, to be a doctor. For if a doctor has learned a little more than the ordinary charlatan, he can make his fortune in Constantinople. Many Franks frequented our house, and one of them persuaded my father to allow me to travel to his native land, to the city of Paris, where such things could be best acquired and free of charge. He wished, however, to take me with himself gratuitously on his journey home. My father, who had also travelled in his youth, agreed, and the Frank told me to hold myself in readiness 3 months hence. I was beside myself with joy at the idea of seeing foreign countries, and eagerly awaited the moment when we should embark. The Frank had at last concluded his business, and prepared himself for the journey. On the evening before our departure, my father led me into his little bedroom. There I saw splendid dresses and arms lying on the table. My looks were, however, chiefly attracted to an immense heap of gold, for I had never before seen so much collected together. My father embraced me and said, "Behold, my son, I have procured for thee clothes for the journey. These weapons are thine. They are the same which thy grandfather hung around me when I went abroad. I know that thou canst use them aright, but only make use of them when thou art attacked. On such occasions, however, defend thyself bravely. My property is not large. Behold, I have divided it into 3 parts, one part for thee, another for my support and spare money, but the third is to me a sacred and untouched property. It is for thee in the hour of need." Thus spoke my old father, tears standing in his eyes, perhaps from some foreboding, for I never saw him again. The journey passed off very well. We had soon reached the land of the Franks, and 6 days later we arrived in the large city of Paris. There my Frankish friend hired a room for me, and advised me to spend wisely my money, which amounted in all to $2,000. I lived 3 years in the city, and learned what is necessary for a skilful doctor to know. I should not, however, be stating the truth if I said that I liked being there, for the customs of this nation displeased me. Besides, I had only a few chosen friends there, and these were noble young men. The longing after home at last possessed me mightily. During the whole of that time I had not heard anything from my father, and I therefore seized a favourable opportunity of reaching home. An embassy from France left for Turkey. I acted as surgeon to the suite of the ambassador, and arrived happily in Stamboul. My father's house was locked, and the neighbours, who were surprised on seeing me, told me my father had died 2 months ago. The priest who had instructed me in my youth brought me the key. Alone and desolate I entered the empty house. All was still in the same position as my father had left it. Only the gold which I had to inherit was gone. I questioned the priest about it, and he, bowing, said, "Your father died a saint, for he has bequeathed his gold to the church." This was and remained inexplicable to me. However, what could I do? I had no witness against the priest, and had to be glad that he had not considered the house and the goods of my father as a bequest. This was the first misfortune that I encountered. Henceforth nothing but ill luck attended me. My reputation as a doctor would not spread at all, because I was ashamed to act the charlatan, and I felt everywhere the want of the recommendation of my father, who would have introduced me to the richest and most distinguished, but who now no longer thought of the poor Zaleukos. The goods of my father also had no sale, for his customers had deserted him after his death, and new ones are only to be got slowly. Thus, when I was one day meditating sadly over my position, it occurred to me that I had often seen in France men of my nation travelling through the country, exhibiting their goods in the markets of the towns. I remembered that the people liked to buy of them, because they came from abroad, and that such a business would be most lucrative. Immediately I resolved what to do. I disposed of my father's house, gave part of the money to a trusty friend to keep for me, and with the rest I brought what was very rare in France, shawls, silk goods, ointments, and oils, took a berth on board a ship, and thus entered upon my second journey to the land of the Franks. It seemed as if fortune had favoured me again as soon as I had turned my back upon the castles of the Dardanelles. Our journey was short and successful. I travelled through the large and small towns of the Franks, and found everywhere willing buyers of my goods. My friend in Stamboul always sent me fresh stores, and my wealth increased day by day. When I had saved at last so much that I thought I might venture on a greater undertaking, I travelled with my goods to Italy. I must, however, confess to something which brought me not a little money. I also employed my knowledge of physic. On reaching a town, I had it published that a Greek physician had arrived, who had already healed many, and in fact my balsam and medicine gained me many a sequin. Thus I had at length reached the city of Florence in Italy. I resolved upon remaining in this town for some time, partly because I liked it so well, partly also because I wished to recruit myself from the exertions of my travels. I hired a vaulted shop in that part of the town called Sta Croce, and not far from this a couple of nice rooms at an inn, leading out upon a balcony. I immediately had my bills circulated, which announced me to be both physician and merchant. Scarcely had I opened my shop when I was besieged by buyers, and in spite of my high prices I sold more than anyone else, because I was obliging and friendly towards my customers. Thus I had already lived 4 days happily in Florence, when one evening, as I was about to close my vaulted room, and on examining once more the contents of my ointment boxes, as I was in the habit of doing, I found in one of the small boxes a piece of paper which I did not remember to have put into it. I unfolded the paper, and found in it an invitation to be on the bridge which is called Ponto Vecchio that night exactly at midnight. I was thinking for a long time as to who it might be who had invited me there, and not knowing a single soul in Florence, I thought perhaps I should be secretly conducted to a patient, a thing which had already often occurred. I therefore determined to proceed thither, but took care to gird on the sword which my father had once presented to me. When it was close upon midnight, I set out on my journey, and soon reached the Ponte Vecchio. I found the bridge deserted, and determined to await the appearance of him who called me. It was a cold night. The moon shone brightly, and I looked down upon the waves of the Arno, which sparkled far away in the moonlight. It was now striking 12 o'clock from all the churches of the city, when I looked up, and saw a tall man standing before me, completely covered in a scarlet cloak, one end of which hid his face. At first I was frightened, because he had made his appearance so suddenly, but was, however, myself again shortly afterwards, and said, "If it is you who have ordered me here, say what you want." The man dressed in scarlet turned round and said in an undertone, "Follow." At this, however, I felt a little timid to go alone with this stranger. I stood still and said, "Not so, sir. Kindly first tell me where. You might also let me see your countenance a little, in order to convince me that you wish me no harm." The Red One, however, did not seem to pay any attention to this. "If thou art unwilling, Zaleukos, remain," he replied, and continued his way. I grew angry. "Do you think," I exclaimed, "a man like myself allows himself to be made a fool of, and to have waited on this cold night for nothing?" In 3 bounds I had reached him, seized him by his cloak, and cried still louder, whilst laying hold of my sabre with my other hand. His cloak, however, remained in my hand, and the stranger had disappeared round the nearest corner. I became calmer by degrees. I had the cloak at any rate, and it was this which would give me the key to this remarkable adventure. I put it on, and continued my way home. When I was at a distance of about 100 paces from it, someone brushed very closely to me, and whispered in the language of the Franks, "Take care, Count. Nothing can be done tonight." Before I had time, however, to turn round, this somebody had passed, and I merely saw a shadow hovering along the houses. I perceived that these words did not concern me, but rather the cloak, yet it gave me no explanation concerning the affair. On the following morning I considered what was to be done. At first I had intended to have the cloak cried in the streets, as if I had found it, but then the stranger might send for it by a third person, and thus no light would be thrown upon the matter. Whilst I was thus thinking, I examined the cloak more closely. It was made of thick Genoese velvet, scarlet in colour, edged with Astrakhan fur, and richly embroidered with gold. The magnificent appearance of the cloak put a thought into my mind, which I resolved to carry out. I carried it into my shop and exposed it for sale, but placed such a high price upon it that I was sure nobody would buy it. My object in this was to scrutinize everybody sharply who might ask for the fur cloak, for the figure of the stranger, which I had seen but superficially, though with some certainty after the loss of the cloak, I should recognize amongst 1,000. There were many would-be purchasers for the cloak, the extraordinary beauty of which attracted everybody, but none resembled the stranger in the slightest degree, and nobody was willing to pay such a high price as 200 sequins for it. What astonished me was that on asking somebody or other if there was not such a cloak in Florence, they all answered no, and assured me they had never seen so precious and tasteful a piece of work. Evening was drawing near, when at last a young man appeared, who had already been to my place, and who had also offered me a great deal for the cloak. He threw a purse with sequins upon the table, and exclaimed, "Of a truth, Zaleukos, I must have thy cloak, should I turn into a beggar over it." He immediately began to count his pieces of gold. I was in a dangerous position. I had only exposed the cloak in order merely to attract the attention of my stranger, and now a young fool came to pay an immense price for it. However, what could I do? I yielded, for on the other hand I was delighted at the idea of being so handsomely recompensed for my nocturnal adventure. The young man put the cloak around him and went away, but on reaching the threshold he returned, whilst unfastening a piece of paper which had been tied to the cloak, and throwing it towards me, he exclaimed, "Here, Zaleukos, hangs something which I dare say does not belong to the cloak." I picked up the piece of paper carelessly, but behold, on it these words were written: "Bring the cloak at the appointed hour tonight to the Ponte Vecchio. 400 sequins are thine." I stood thunderstruck. Thus I had lost my fortune and completely missed my aim. Yet I did not think long. I picked up the 200 sequins, jumped after the one who had bought the cloak, and said, "Dear friend, take back your sequins, and give me the cloak. I cannot possibly part with it." He first regarded the matter as a joke, but when he saw that I was in earnest, he became angry at my demand, called me a fool, and finally it came to blows. However, I was fortunate enough to wrench the cloak from him in the scuffle, and was about to run away with it, when the young man called the police to his assistance, and we both appeared before the judge. The latter was much surprised at the accusation, and adjudicated the cloak in favor of my adversary. I offered the young man 20, 50, 80, even 100 sequins in addition to his 200, if he would part with the cloak. What my entreaties could not do, my gold did. He accepted it. I, however, went away with the cloak triumphantly, and had to appear to the whole town of Florence as a madman. I did not care, however, about the opinion of the people. I knew better than they that I had profited after all by the bargain. Impatiently I awaited the night. At the same hour as before, I went with the cloak under my arm towards the Ponte Vecchio. With the last stroke of 12, the figure appeared out of the darkness and came towards me. It was unmistakably the man whom I had seen yesterday. "Hast thou the cloak?" he asked me. "Yes, sir," I replied, "but it cost me 100 sequins ready money." "I know it," replied the other. "Look here. Here are 400. He went with me towards the wide balustrade of the bridge and counted out the money. There were 400. They sparkled magnificently in the moonlight. Their glitter rejoiced my heart. Alas, I did not anticipate that this would be its last joy. I put the money into my pocket, and was desirous of thoroughly looking at my kind and unknown stranger, but he wore a mask, through which dark eyes stared at me frightfully. "I thank you, sir, for your kindness," I said to him. "What else do you require of me? I tell you beforehand it must be an honourable transaction." "There is no occasion for alarm," he replied, whilst winding the cloak around his shoulders. "I require your assistance as surgeon, not for one alive, but dead." "What do you mean?" I exclaimed, full of surprise. "I arrived with my sister from abroad," he said, and beckoned me at the same time to follow him. "I lived here with her at the house of a friend. My sister died yesterday, suddenly, of a disease, and my relatives wish to bury her tomorrow. According to an old custom of our family, all are to be buried in the tomb of our ancestors. Many, notwithstanding, who died in foreign countries, are buried there and embalmed. I do not grudge my relatives her body, but for my father I want at least the head of his daughter, in order that he may see her once more. This custom of severing the heads of beloved relatives appeared to me somewhat awful, yet I did not dare to object to it, lest I should offend the stranger. I told him that I was acquainted with the embalming of the dead, and begged him to conduct me to the deceased. Yet I could not help asking him why all this must be done so mysteriously and at night. He answered me that his relatives, who considered his intention horrible, objected to it by daylight. If only the head were shivered, then they could say no more about it. Although he might have brought me the head, yet a natural feeling had prevented him from severing it himself. In the meantime we had reached a large, splendid house. My companion pointed it out to me at the end of our nocturnal walk. We passed the principal entrance of the house, entered a little door, which the stranger carefully locked behind him, and now ascended, in the dark, a narrow spiral staircase. It led towards a dimly lighted passage, out of which we entered a room lighted by a lamp fastened to the ceiling. In the room was a bed, on which the corpse lay. The stranger turned aside his face, evidently endeavouring to hide his tears. He pointed towards the bed, telling me to do my business well and quickly, and left the room. I took my instruments, which I as surgeon always carried about with me, and approached the bed. Only the head of the corpse was visible, and it was so beautiful that I experienced involuntarily the deepest sympathy. Dark hair hung down in long plaits, the features were pale, the eyes closed, At first I made an incision into the skin, after the manner of surgeons when amputating a limb. Then I took my sharpest knife, and with one stroke cut the throat. But oh, horror! The dead opened her eyes, but immediately closed them again, and with a deep sigh she now seemed to breathe her last. At the same moment a stream of hot blood shot towards me from the wound. I was convinced that the poor creature had been killed by me. That she was dead there was no doubt, for there was no recovery from this wound. I stood for some minutes in painful anguish at what had happened. Had the red cloak deceived me, or had his sister perhaps merely been apparently dead? The latter seemed to me more likely, but I dare not tell the brother of the deceased that perhaps a little less deliberate cut might have awakened her without killing her. Therefore I wished to sever the head completely. But once more the dying woman groaned, stretched herself out in painful movements, and died. Fright overpowered me, and shuddering I hastened out of the room. But outside in the passage it was dark, for the light was out. No trace of my companion was to be seen, and I was obliged haphazard to feel my way in the dark along the wall in order to reach the staircase. I discovered it at last and descended, partly falling and partly gliding. But there was not a soul downstairs. I merely found the door ajar and breathed freer on reaching the street, for I had felt very strange inside the house. Urged on by terror, I rushed towards my dwelling place and buried myself in the cushions of my bed in order to forget the terrible thing that I had done. But sleep deserted me, and only the morning admonished me again to take courage. It seemed to me probable that the man who had induced me to commit this nefarious deed, as it now appeared to me, might not denounce me. I immediately resolved to set to work in my vaulted room, and if possible to assume an indifferent look. But alas! An additional circumstance, which I only now noticed, increased my anxiety still more. My cap and my girdle, as well as my instruments, were wanting, and I was uncertain as to whether I had left them in the room of the murdered girl, or whether I had lost them in my flight. The former seemed indeed the more likely, and thus I could easily be discovered as the murderer. At the accustomed hour I opened my vaulted room. My neighbour came in, as was his wont every morning, for he was a talkative man. "Well," he said, "what do you say about the terrible affair which has occurred during the night?" I pretended not to know anything. "What? Do you not know what is known all over the town? Are you not aware that the loveliest flower in Florence, Bianca, the governor's daughter, was murdered last night? I saw her only yesterday driving through the streets in so cheerful a manner with her intended one, for today the marriage was to have taken place." I felt deeply wounded at each word of my neighbour. Many a time my torment was renewed, for every one of my customers told me of the affair, each one more ghastly than the other, and yet nobody could relate anything more terrible than that which I had seen myself. About midday, a police officer entered my shop and requested me to send the people away. "Signor Zaleukos," he said, producing the things which I had missed. "Do these things belong to you?" I was thinking as to whether I should not entirely repudiate them, but on seeing through the door, which stood ajar, my landlord and several acquaintances, I determined not to aggravate the affair by telling a lie, and acknowledged myself as the owner of the things. The police officer asked me to follow him, and led me towards a large building, which I soon recognized as the prison. There he showed me into a room meanwhile. My situation was terrible, as I thought of it in my solitude. The idea of having committed a murder unintentionally constantly presented itself to my mind. I also could not conceal from myself that the glitter of the gold had captivated my feelings. Otherwise I should not have fallen blindly into the trap. 2 hours after my arrest I was led out of my cell. I descended several steps until at last I reached a great hall. Around a long table draped in black were seated 12 men, mostly old men. There were benches along the sides of the hall, filled with the most distinguished of Florence. The galleries, which were above, were thickly crowded with spectators. When I had stepped towards the table covered with black cloth, A man with a gloomy and sad countenance rose. It was the governor. He said to the assembly that he, as the father in this affair, could not sentence, and that he resigned his place on this occasion to the eldest of the senators. The eldest of the senators was an old man, at least 90 years of age. He stood in a bent attitude, and his temples were covered with thin white hair, but his eyes were as yet very fiery, and his voice powerful and weighty. He commenced by asking me whether I confessed to the murder. I requested him to allow me to speak, and related undauntedly and with a clear voice what I had done and what I knew. I noticed that the governor during my recital at one time turned pale, and at another time red. When I had finished, he rose angrily. "What, wretch!" he exclaimed, "dost thou even dare to impute a crime which thou hast committed from greediness to another?" The senator reprimanded him for his interruption, since he had voluntarily renounced his right. Besides, it was not clear that I did the deed from greediness, for according to his own statement, nothing had been stolen from the victim. He even went further. He told the governor that he must give an account of the early life of his daughter, for then only it would be possible to decide whether I had spoken the truth or not. At the same time he adjourned the court for the day, in order, as he said, to consult the papers of the deceased, which the governor would give him. I was again taken back to my prison, where I spent a wretched day, always fervently wishing that a link between the deceased and the red cloak might be discovered. Full of hope, I entered the court of justice the next day. Several letters were lying upon the table. The old senator asked me whether they were in my handwriting. I looked at them and noticed that they must have been written by the same hand as the other two papers which I had received. I communicated this to the senators, but no attention was paid to it, and they told me that I might have written both, for the signature of the letters was undoubtedly a Z, the first letter of my name. The letters, however, contained threats against the deceased and warnings against the marriage which she was about to contract. The governor seemed to have given extraordinary information concerning me, for I was treated with more suspicion and rigor on this day. I referred, to justify myself, to my papers which must be in my room, but was told that they had been looked for without success. Thus, at the conclusion of this sitting, all hope vanished, and on being brought into the court the third day, judgment was pronounced on me. I was convicted of wilful murder and condemned to death. Things had come to such a pass. Deserted by all that was precious to me upon earth, far away from home, I was to die innocently in the bloom of my life. On the evening of this terrible day, which had decided my fate, I was sitting in my lonely cell. My hopes were gone, my thoughts steadfastly fixed upon death, when the door of my prison opened, and in came a man who for a long time looked at me silently. "It is thus I find you again, Zaleukos," he said. I had not recognized him by the dim light of my lamp, but the sound of his voice roused in me old remembrances. It was Valetti, one of those few friends whose acquaintance I made in the city of Paris when I was studying there. He said that he had come to Florence accidentally, where his father, who was a distinguished man, lived. He had heard about my affair and had come to see me once more, and to hear from his own lips how I could have committed such a crime. I related to him the whole affair. He seemed much surprised at it, and adjured me, as my only friend, to tell him all, in order not to leave the world with a lie behind me. I confirmed my assertions with an oath that I had spoken the truth, and that I was not guilty of anything, except the glitter of the gold had dazzled me, and that I had not perceived the improbability of the story of the stranger. "Did you not know Bianca?" he asked me. I assured him that I had never seen her. Valetti now related to me that a profound mystery rested on the affair, that the governor had very much accelerated my condemnation, and now a report was spread that I had known Bianca for a long time, and had murdered her out of revenge for her marriage with someone else. I told him that all this coincided exactly with the red cloak, but that I was unable to prove his participation in the affair. Valetti embraced me weeping, and promised me to do all, at least to save my life. I had little hope, though I knew that Valetti was a clever man, well versed in the laws, and that he would do all in his power to save my life. For 2 long days I was in uncertainty, At last Valetti appeared. "I bring consolation, though painful. You will live and be free with the loss of one hand." Affected, I thanked my friend for saving my life. He told me that the governor had been inexorable in having the affair investigated a second time, but that he at last, in order not to appear unjust, had agreed that if a similar case could be found in the law books of the history of Florence, my punishment should be the same as the one recorded in these books. He and his father had searched in the old books day and night, and at last found a case quite similar to mine. The sentence was, that his left hand be cut off, his property confiscated, and he himself banished forever. This was my punishment also, and he asked me to prepare for the painful hour which awaited me. I will not describe to you that terrible hour, where I laid my hand upon the block in the public market-place, and my own blood shot over me in broad streams. Valetti took me to his house until I had recovered. He then most generously supplied me with money for travelling, for all I had acquired with so much difficulty had fallen a prey to the law. I left Florence for Sicily, and embarked on the first ship I had found for Constantinople. My hope was fixed upon the sum which I had entrusted to my friend. I also requested to be allowed to live with him. But how great was my astonishment on being asked why I did not wish to live in my own house. He told me that some unknown man had bought a house in the Greek quarter in my name, and this very man had also told the neighbours of my early arrival. I immediately proceeded thither accompanied by my friend, and was received by all my old acquaintances joyfully. An old merchant gave me a letter, which the man who had bought the house for me had left behind. I read as follows: Zaleukos. 2 hands are prepared to work incessantly, in order that you may not feel the loss of one of yours. The house which you see and all its contents are yours, and every year you will receive enough to be counted amongst the rich of your people. Forgive him who is unhappier than yourself. I could guess who had written it, and in answer to my question the merchant told me it had been a man whom he took for a Frank, and who had worn a scarlet cloak. I knew enough to understand that the stranger was, after all, not entirely devoid of noble intentions. In my new house I found everything arranged in the best style, also a vaulted room stored with goods more splendid than I had ever had. 10 years have passed since. I still continue my commercial travels, more from old custom than necessity. Yet I have never again seen that country where I became so unfortunate. Every year since I have received 1,000 gold pieces, and although I rejoice to know that unfortunate man to be noble, yet he cannot relieve me of the sorrow of my soul, for the terrible picture of the murdered Bianca is continually on my mind. End of The Severed Hand by Wilhelm Hauff. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. The Ash Tree by M.R. James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Ash Tree by M.R. James. Everyone who has travelled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they have always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then I liked the pillared portico, perhaps stuck onto a red brick Queen Anne house, which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside, going up to the roof, which hall ought always to be provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library, too, where you may find anything from a Psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespearean quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and perhaps most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was when it was first built, and in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, and not least now, when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied, and life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses, and enough money to keep it together and entertain my friends in it modestly. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is Castringham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than out, park with fringe woods and mere. The one feature that marked out the house from a score of others is gone. As you looked at it from the park, you saw on the right a great old ash tree growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, and almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling-house built. At any rate, it had well-nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reasons, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offence really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual powers of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the mere cruelty of the witch-finders, these are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved, and the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto da fe. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only in being rather better off and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character, and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window, at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so, she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he had made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the park in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night he had been at the pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross, and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures, at Bury, St. Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, the deputy sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life so in death, of a very different temper. Her poisonous rage, as a reporter of the time puts it, did so work upon the bystanders, yea, even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her, that she presented the living aspect of a mad devil. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law, only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that, as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said was the seemingly meaningless words, "There will be guests at the hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared, then and afterwards, that he could not give any other account of the matter than that he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him. But he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park, and walked to the hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home. So the vicar, Mr. Crome, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and, as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of his regarding his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Crome thought of starting for home, about 9:30 o'clock, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crome was this. They were in sight of the ash tree, which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is that runs up and down the stem of the ash? It is never a squirrel. They will all be in their nests by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its colour in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn, he said, though it sounded foolish, that, squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the two men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor yet at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you have guessed. That there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then by his directions rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Crome himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He has left some notes among his papers, which show how genuine a respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew, and there is also this passage, which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have it in this season. He had his evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and to-night had not drunk it out. This drink was examined by the physician from Bury, a Mr. Hawkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it. For, as was natural, in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse, there was talk made among the neighbours of poison. The body was very much disordered as it lay in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave too probable conjecture that my worthy friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. And what is as yet unexplained, and to myself the argument of some horrid and artful design in the perpetrators of this barbarous murder, was this, that the women which were entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it, being both sad persons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress both of mind and body, saying, what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands than they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which, with their whole forearms, in no long time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that, as afterwards proved, During many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no mark seen on the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able, by the help of a small magnifying lens of crystal, of the condition of the skin on this part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced, remembering that ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of the horrid act of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as in matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising, to read a set portion, and I taking it up, not without a tear, duly paid to him, which from the study of this poorer adumbration was now passed to the contemplation of its great original. It came into my thoughts, as at such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the last glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old and by many accounted superstitious practice of drawing the swords, of which a principal insurance, in the case of his late Sacred Majesty the blessed martyr King Charles and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must need admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me, yet, as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched out, I set down the results, in the case it may be found that they pointed the true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I made then 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in the first these words, from Luke 13:7, cut it down; in the second, Isaiah 13:20, it shall never be inhabited; and upon the third experiment, Job 34:30, her young ones also suck up blood. That is all that need be quoted from Mr. Crome's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crome on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger and the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist, it being the vicar's view, as well as the most commonly held in the neighbourhood, that the squire was the victim of a recrudescence of the Popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates, and so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room in which his father had died, nor indeed was it slept in by any one but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the details will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all of his beasts in sheds at night, and keeping no sheep in his park, for he had noticed that nothing was ever attacked that spent the night indoors. After that the disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chase. But as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all-night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built out of the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Crome. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed, and the feeling of surprise and indeed disquiet was very strong when it was found that, though her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside it of body, bones, or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying no such things were dreamt of as resurrection men, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body otherwise than for the use of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and of the exploits of the witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. Before his time, the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard had travelled in Italy and become infected with the Italian taste, and, having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar masked the brick. Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the mere, and Castringham took on an entirely new, and I must say a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired, and served as a model to a good many of the neighbouring gentry in after years. One morning, it was in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney had smoked persistently, and yet it was so cold that he must keep up a fire. Also, something had so rattled about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day, which would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of the distemper, which continued among his game, had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He could certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast, and after it he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that with a northern. This door the servants would be always passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know that there is but one room like that in the house." "Which may that be?" said Sir Richard. "And that is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there I'll lie tonight," said her master. "Which way is it?" "Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there for these 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke, and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber, at least." So it was opened, and indeed the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and, impatiently, as was his wont, threw the shutters back and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, grown up as it was with a great ash tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chiddock, all to-day, and move my bed furniture in the afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice, breaking in on this speech, "might I have the favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round, and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will, perhaps, hardly remember me. My name is William Crome, and my grandfather was vicar here in your grandfather's time." "Well, sir," said Sir Richard, "the name of Crome is always a passport to Castringham. I am glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations standing. In what can I serve you? For your hour of calling, and if I do not mistake you, your bearing shows you to be in some haste." "That is no more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds with what haste I can make, and I have called in on my way to leave with you some papers which we have but just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left at his death. It is thought you may find some matters of family interest in them. You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crome, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlour and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these same papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, be about airing this chamber. Yes, it is here my grandfather died. Yes, the tree, perhaps, does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not wish to listen to any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir? They went to the study. The packet which young Mr. Crome had brought, he was then just become a Fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I may say, and subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Pollianus, contained among other things the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical sortes biblicae which you have heard. They amused him a good deal. Well, he said, my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, he may be rest assured. I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of catarrhs and eggs was never seen. The parlour contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. I wonder, says he, whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him. Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which sure enough bore on the fly-leaf of the inscription, To Matthew Fell, from his loving godmother, Anne Aldous, 2nd September, 1659. It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crome. I will wager we get a couple of names in the chronicles. What have we here? Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, hey? No more prophets for me. They're all in a tale. And now, Mr. Crome, I am infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray allow me another glass. So, with offers of hospitality which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Hervey, Sir William Kentfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace and talking over the alterations and improvements in the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard. Why is that, my lord? It is, in fact, my own. Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree, and you have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps, the bishop went on, with a smile, it has given you a touch of its quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you. That, or something else, it is true, cost me my sleep from 12 to 4, my lord. But the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much more from it. I applaud your determination. It can hardly be wholesome to have the air you breathe strained, as it were, through all that leafage. Your lordship is right, I think, but I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass, that kept me open-eyed. I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you see it from this point. None of these nearest branches can even touch your casement unless there was a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot. No, sir, true. What then will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so? Aye, and covered the dust on my sill with lines and marks. At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms, and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we are in his bedroom, with the light out and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside still and warm, so the window stands open. There is very little light about the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro, with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which moved back and forward, even as low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There. Something drops off the bed with a soft plump, like a kitten, and is out of the window in a flash. Another, 4, and after that there is quiet again. Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. As with Sir Matthew, so with Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, popish emissaries, infected air, all these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tom-cat was crouching, looking down the hollow which years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Every one looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell as came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams there were. The witnesses are not sure which, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Hervey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Kentfield stayed. Yet even they were daunted, though it was only at the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant to search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up, and looking down the hollow could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern, and let it down by a rope. "We must get at the bottom of this. My life upon it, my lord, but secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern, and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing, before he cried out in a dreadful voice and fell back from the ladder, where happily he was caught by 2 of the men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. But then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken at the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there. For in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the Bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for clearly whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First at the fork they saw a round body covered with fire the size of a man's head appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times. Then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where after a moment it lay still. The Bishop went as near as he dared to it, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, venous and seared. And as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with greyish hair. All that day the ash burned, until it fell to pieces. The men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. They found, says the Bishop of Kilmore, below it a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures that had plainly been smothered by the smoke. And what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching, the anatomy or skeleton of a human being, with the skin dried upon the bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years. End of The Ash Tree by M.R. James, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. The Vision of Tom Chuff by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Vision of Tom Chuff by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. At the edge of melancholy Catstean Moor, in the north of England, with half a dozen ancient poplar trees with rugged and hoary stems around, one smashed across the middle by a flash of lightning 30 summers before, and all by their great height dwarfing the abode near which they stand, there squats a rude stone house with a thick chimney, a kitchen and bedroom on the ground floor, and a loft, accessible by a ladder, under the shingle roof divided into 2 rooms. Its owner was a man of ill repute. Tom Chuff was his name, a shock-headed, broad-shouldered, powerful man, though somewhat short, with lowering brows and a sullen eye. He was a poacher, and hardly made an ostensible pretence of earning his bread by any honest industry. He was a drunkard. He beat his wife, and led his children a life of terror and lamentation when he was at home. It was a blessing to his frightened little family when he absented himself, as he sometimes did, for a week or more together. On the night I speak of, he knocked at the door with his cudgel at about 8 o'clock. It was winter, and the night was very dark. Had the summons been that of a bogey from the moor, the inmates of this small house could hardly have heard it with greater terror. His wife unbarred the door in fear and haste. Her hunchbacked sister stood by the hearth, staring toward the threshold, the children cowering behind. Tom Chuff entered with his cudgel in his hand, without speaking, and threw himself into a chair opposite the fire. He had been away 2 or 3 days. He looked haggard, and his eyes were bloodshot. They knew he had been drinking. Tom raked and knocked the peat fire with his stick, and thrust his feet close to it. He signed towards the little dresser, and nodded to his wife, and she knew he wanted a cup, which in silence she gave him. He pulled a bottle of gin from his coat pocket, and nearly filling the teacup, drank off the dram at a few gulps. He usually refreshed himself with 2 or 3 drams of this kind before beating the inmates of his house. His 3 little children, cowering in a corner, eyed him from under a table, as Jack did the ogre in the nursery tale. His wife, Nell, standing behind a chair, which he was ready to snatch up to meet the blow of the cudgel, which might be levelled at her at any moment, never took her eyes off him, and hunchbacked Mary showed the whites of a large pair of eyes, similarly employed, as she stood against the oaken press, her dark face hardly distinguishable in the distance from the brown panel behind it. Tom Chuff was at his 3rd dram, and had not yet spoken a word since his entrance, and the suspense was growing dreadful, when on a sudden he leaned back in his rude seat. The cudgel slipped from his hand. A change and a death-like pallor came over his face. For a while they all stared on. Such was their fear of him. They dared not speak or move, lest it should prove to have been but a doze, and Tom should wake up and proceed forthwith to gratify his temper and exercise his cudgel. In a very little time, however, things began to look so odd that they ventured, his wife and Mary, to exchange glances full of doubt and wonder. He hung so much over the side of the chair that if it had not been one of cyclopean clumsiness and weight, he would have borne it to the floor. A leaden tint was darkening the pallor of his face. They were becoming alarmed, and finally, braving everything, his wife timidly said, "Tom," and then more sharply repeated it, and finally cried the appellative loudly, and again, with a terrified accompaniment. "He's dying! He's dying!" her voice rising to a scream, as she found that neither it nor her plucks and shakings of him by the shoulder had the slightest effect in recalling him from his torpor. And now, from sheer terror of a new kind, the children added their shrilly piping to the talk and cries of their seniors, and if anything could have called Tom up from his lethargy, it might have been the piercing chorus that made the rude chamber of the poacher's habitation ring again. But Tom continued unmoved, deaf, and stirless. His wife sent Mary down to the village, hardly a quarter of a mile away, to implore of the doctor, for whose family she did as laundress, to come down and look at her husband, who seemed to be dying. The doctor, who was a good-natured fellow, arrived. With his hat still on, he looked at Tom, examined him, and when he found that the emetic he had brought with him, on conjecture from Mary's description, did not act, and that this lancet brought no blood, and that he felt a pulseless wrist, he shook his head, and inwardly thought, "What the plague is the woman crying for? Could she have desired a greater blessing for her children and herself than the very thing that has happened?" Tom, in fact, seemed quite gone. At his lips no breath was perceptible. The doctor could discover no pulse. His hands and feet were cold, and the chill was stealing up into his body. The doctor, after a stay of 20 minutes, had buttoned up his greatcoat again, and pulled down his hat, and told Mrs. Chuff that there was no use in his remaining any longer, when all of a sudden a little rill of blood began to trickle from the lancet cut in Tom Chuff's temple. "That's very odd," said the doctor. "Let us wait a little." I must describe now the sensations which Tom Chuff had experienced. With his elbows on his knees and his chin upon his hands, he was staring into the embers, with his gin beside him, when suddenly a swimming came in his head. He lost sight of the fire, and a sound like one stroke of a loud church bell smote his brain. Then he heard a confused humming, and the leaden weight of his head held him backward as he sank in his chair, and consciousness quite forsook him. When he came to himself, he felt chilled, and was leaning against a huge leafless tree. The night was moonless, and when he looked up he thought he had never seen stars so large and bright, or sky so black. The stars, too, seemed to blink down with longer intervals of darkness, and fiercer and more dazzling emergence, and something, he vaguely thought, of the character of silent menace and fury. He had confused recollection of having come there, or rather of having been carried along, as if on men's shoulders, with a sort of rushing motion. But it was utterly indistinct, the imperfect recollection simply of a sensation. He had seen or heard nothing on his way. He looked round. There was not a sign of a living creature near, and he began with a sense of awe to recognize the place. The tree against which he had been leaning was one of the noble old beeches that surrounded at irregular intervals the churchyard of Shackleton, which spread its green and wavy lap on the edge of the moor of Catstean, at the opposite side of which stands the rude cottage in which he had just lost consciousness. It was 6 miles or more across the moor to his habitation, and the black expanse lay before him, disappearing dismally in the darkness, so that, looking straight back before him, sky and land blended together in an undistinguishable and awful blank. There was a silence quite unnatural over the place. The distant murmur of the brook, which he knew so well, was dead. Not a whisper in the leaves about him. The air, earth, everything about and above was indescribably still, and he experienced that shaking of the heart that seems to portend the approach of something awful. He would have set out upon his return across the moor, had he not had an undefined presentiment that he was waylaid by something he dared not pass. The old grey church and tower of Shackleton stood like a shadow in the rear. His eye had grown accustomed to the obscurity, and he could just trace its outline. There were no comforting associations in his mind connected with it, nothing but menace and misgiving. His early training in his lawless calling was connected with this very spot. Here his father used to meet 2 other poachers, and bring his son, then but a boy, with him. Under the church porch, towards morning, they used to divide the game they had taken, and take account of the sales they had made on the previous day, and make partition of the money, and drink their gin. It was here he had taken his early lessons in drinking, cursing, and lawlessness. His father's grave was hardly 8 steps from the spot where he stood. In his present state of awful dejection, no scene on earth could have so helped to heighten his fear. There was one object close by which added to his gloom. About a yard away, in the rear of the tree, behind himself, and extending to his left, was an open grave, the mould and rubbish pile on the other side. At the head of this grave stood the beech tree. Its columnar stem rose like a huge monumental pillar. He knew every line and crease on its smooth surface. The initial letters of his own name, cut in its bark long ago, had spread out and wrinkled like the grotesque capitals of a fanciful engraver, and now with a sinister significance overlooked the open grave, as if answering his mental question, "Who for is grave cut?" He felt still a little stunned, and there was a faint tremor in his joints that disinclined him to exert himself, and further, he had a vague apprehension that, take what direction he might, there was danger around him worse than that of staying where he was. On a sudden the stars began to blink more fiercely. A faint wild light overspread for a minute the bleak landscape, and he saw approaching from the moor a figure at a kind of swinging trot, which now and then a zigzag hop or two, such as men accustomed to cross such places make, to avoid the patches of slob or quag that meet them here and there. This figure resembled his father's, and like him whistled through his finger by way of signal as he approached. But the whistle sounded not now shrilly and sharp as in old times, but immensely far away, and seemed to sing strangely through Tom's head. From habit or from fear, in answer to the signal, Tom whistled as he used to do 25 years ago and more, although he was already chilled with an unearthly fear. Like his father, too, the figure held up the bag there was in his left hand as he drew near, when it was his custom to call out to him what was in it. It did not reassure the watcher, you may be certain, when a shout unnaturally faint reached him, as the phantom dangled the bag in the air, and he heard with a faint distinctness the word, "Tom Chuff's soul." Scarcely 50 yards away from the low churchyard fence at which Tom was standing, there was a wider chasm in the peat, which there threw up a growth of reeds and bulrushes, among which, as the old poacher used to do on a sudden alarm, the approaching figure suddenly cast itself down. From the same patch of tall reeds and rushes emerged instantaneously what he at first mistook for the same figure creeping on all fours, but what he soon perceived to be an enormous black dog with a rough coat like a bear's, which at first sniffed about, and then started towards him in what seemed to be a sportive amble, bouncing this way and that. But as it drew near, it displayed a pair of fearful eyes that glowed like live coals, and emitted from the monstrous expanse of its jaws a terrifying growl. The beast seemed on the point of seizing him, and Tom recoiled in panic and fell into the open grave behind him. The edge which he caught as he tumbled gave way, and down he went, expecting almost at the same instant to reach the bottom. But never was such a fall. Bottomless seemed the abyss. Down, 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 with immeasurable and still increasing speed, through utter darkness, with hair streaming straight upward, breathless, he shot with a rush of air against him, the force of which whirled up his very arms, second after second, minute after minute. Through the chasm downward he flew, the icy perspiration of horror covering his body, and suddenly, as he expected to be dashed into annihilation, his descent was in an instant arrested with a tremendous shock, which, however, did not deprive him of consciousness even for a moment. He looked about him. The place resembled a smoke-stained cavern or catacomb, the roof of which, except for a ribbed arch here and there faintly visible, was lost in darkness. From several rude passages, like the galleries of a gigantic mine, which opened from this centre chamber, was very dimly emitted a dull glow as of charcoal, which was the only light by which he could imperfectly discern the objects immediately about him. What seemed like a projecting piece of the rock at the corner of one of these murky entrances moved on a sudden, and proved to be a human figure that beckoned him. He approached and saw his father. He could barely recognize him. He was so monstrously altered. "I've been looking for you, Tom. Welcome home, lad. come along to your place." Tom's heart sank as he heard these words, which were spoken in a hollow and, he thought, derisive voice that made him tremble. But he could not help accompanying the wicked spirit, which led him into a place, in passing which he heard, as it were from within the rock, dreadful cries and appeals for mercy. "What is this?" said he. "Never mind." "Who are they?" "Newcomers like yourself, lad," answered his father apathetically. "They give over that work in time, finding it is no use." "What shall I do?" said Tom in an agony. "It's all one." "But what shall I do?" reiterated Tom, quivering in every joint and nerve. "Grin and bear it, I suppose. For God's sakes, if you ever cared for me as I am your own child, let me out of this." "There's no way out." "If there's a way in, there's a way out. And for heaven's sake, let me out of this." But the dreadful figure made no further answer, and glided backwards by his shoulder to the rear, and others appeared in view, each with a faint red halo round it, staring on him with frightful eyes, images, all in hideous variety, of eternal fury or derision. He was growing mad, it seemed, under the stare of so many eyes, increasing in number, and drawing closer every moment, and at the same time myriads and myriads of voices were calling him by his name, some far away, some near, some from one point, some from another, some from behind, close to his ears. These cries were increased in rapidity and multitude, and mingled with laughter, with flitting blasphemies, with broken insults and mockeries, succeeded and obliterated by others, before he could half catch their meaning. All this time, in proportion to the rapidity and urgency of these dreadful sights and sounds, the epilepsy of terror was creeping up to his brain, and with a long and dreadful scream he lost consciousness. When he recovered his senses, he found himself in a small stone chamber, vaulted above, and with a ponderous door. A single point of light in the wall, with a strange brilliancy, illuminated this cell. Seated opposite him was a venerable man with a snowy beard of immense length, an image of awful purity and severity. He was dressed in a coarse robe with 3 large keys suspended from his girdle. He might have filled one's idea of an ancient porter of a city gate. Such spiritual cities, I should say, as John Bunyan loved to describe. This old man's eyes were brilliant and awful, and fixed on him as they were, Tom Chuff felt himself helplessly in his power. At length he spoke. "The command is given to let you forth for one trial more. But if you are found again drinking with the drunken, and beating your fellow servants, you shall return through the door by which you came, and go out no more." With these words the old man took him by the wrist and led him through the first door, and then unlocking one that stood in the cavern outside, he struck Tom Chuff sharply on the shoulder, and the door shut behind him with a sound that boomed peal after peal of thunder near and far away, and all round and above, till it rolled off gradually into silence. It was totally dark, but there was a fanning of fresh cool air that overpowered him. He felt that he was in the upper world again. In a few minutes he began to hear voices which he knew, and first a faint point of light appeared before his eyes, and gradually he saw the flame of the candle, and after that the familiar faces of his wife and children, and he heard them faintly when they spoke to him, although he was as yet unable to answer. He also saw the doctor, like an isolated figure in the dark, and heard him say, "There now, you have him back. He'll do, I think." His first words, when he could speak, and saw clearly all about him, and felt the blood on his neck and shirt, were, "Wife, forgive me. I'm a changed man. Send forth, sir." Which last phrase meant, "Send for the clergyman." When the vicar came and entered the little bedroom where the scared poacher whose soul had died with him was lying, still sick and weak, in his bed, and with a spirit that was prostrate with terror, Tom Chuff feebly beckoned the rest from the room, and the door being closed, the good parson heard the strange confession, and with equal amazement the man's earnest and agitated vows of amendment, and his helpless appeals to him for support and counsel. These, of course, were kindly met, and the visits of the rector for some time were frequent. One day, when he took Tom Chuff's hand on bidding him good-bye, The sick man held it still and said, "You're Vicar o' Shackleton, sir, and if I shall dee, you promise me a thing as I have promised ye a many. I have said I never give wife, nor barn, nor folk, or no sort, scalp nor scissor more, and ye'll know o' me no more among the cypers. Nor never will Tom draw trigger, nor set a snare again, but in an honest way. And after that ye'll no make it a bootless bane for me, but being, as I say, Vicar o' Shackleton, and able to do as ye list, ye'll no let them bury me within 20 good yeard one's measure o' the ad beech trees that's round the churchyard of Shackleton." "I see. You would have your grave, when your time really comes, a good way from the place where lay the grave you dreamed of." "That's just it. I'd lie at the bottom o' a marl pit lifer, and I'd be laid in anither churchyard just to be shut o' my fear of that. But that o' my kinsfolk is buried beyond in Shackleton, and ye'll give me your promise and no break your word." "I do promise, certainly. I'm not likely to outlive you, but if I should, and still be Vicar of Shackleton, you shall be buried somewhere as near the middle of the churchyard as we can find space." "That'll do." And so content they parted. The effect of the vision upon Tom Chuff was powerful, and promised to be lasting. With a sore effort he exchanged his life of desultory adventure and comparative idleness for one of regular industry. He gave up drinking. He was as kind as an originally surly nature would allow to his wife and family. He went to church. In fine weather they crossed the moor to Shackleton Church. The vicar said he came there to look at the scenery of his vision, and to fortify his good resolutions by the reminder. Impressions upon the imagination, however, are but transitory, and a bad man acting under fear is not a free agent. His real character does not appear. But as the images of the imagination fade, and the action of fear abates, the essential qualities of the man reassert themselves. So after a time, Tom Chuff began to grow weary of his new life. He grew lazy, and people began to say that he was catching hares and pursuing his old contraband way of life under the rose. He came home one hard night with signs of the bottle in his thick speech and violent temper. Next day he was sorry or frightened, at all events repentant, and for a week or more something of the old horror returned, and he was once again on his good behavior. But in a little time came a relapse, and another repentance, and then a relapse again, and gradually the return of old habits, and the flooding in of all his old way of life, with more violence and gloom, in proportion as the man was alarmed and exasperated by the remembrance of his despised but terrible warning. With the old life returned the misery of the cottage. The smiles which had begun to appear with the unwonted sunshine were seen no more. Instead returned to his poor wife's face the old pale and heartbroken look. The cottage lost its neat and cheerful air, and the melancholy of neglect was visible. Sometimes at night were overheard by a chance passer-by cries and sobs from that ill-omened dwelling. Tom Chuff was now often drunk, and not very often at home, except when he came in to sweep away his poor wife's earnings. Tom had long lost sight of the honest old parson. There was shame mixed with his degradation. He had grace enough left when he saw the thin figure of Sir walking along the road to turn out of his way and avoid meeting him. The clergyman shook his head, and sometimes groaned, when his name was mentioned. His horror and regret were more for the poor wife than for the relapsed sinner, for her case was pitiable indeed. Her brother, Jack Everton, coming home from Hexley, having heard stories of all this, determined to beat Tom for his ill treatment of his sister within an inch of his life. Luckily, perhaps, for all concerned, Tom happened to be away upon one of his long excursions, and poor Nell besought her brother, in extremity of terror, not to interpose between them. So he took his leave, and went home muttering and sulky. Now it happened a few months later that Nelly Chuff fell sick. She had been ailing, as heartbroken people do, for a good while, but now the end had come. There was a coroner's inquest when she died, for the doctors had doubts as to whether a blow had not at least hastened her death. Nothing certain, however, came of the inquiry. Tom Chuff had left his home more than 2 days before his wife's death. He was absent upon his lawless business still when the coroner had held his quest. Jack Everton came over from Hexley to attend the dismal obsequies of his sister. He was more incensed than ever with the wicked husband who, one way or other, had hastened Nelly's death. The inquest had closed early in the day. The husband had not appeared. An occasional companion, perhaps I ought to say accomplice, of Chuff's happened to turn up. He had left him on the borders of Westmoreland, and said he would probably be home next day. But Everton affected not to believe it. Perhaps it was to Tom Chuff, he suggested, a secret satisfaction to crown the history of his bad married life with the scandal of his absence from the funeral of his neglected and abused wife. Everton had taken on himself the direction of the melancholy preparations. He had ordered a grave to be opened for his sister beside her mother's in Shackleton churchyard, at the other side of the moor. For the purpose, as I have said, of marking the callous neglect of her husband, he determined that the funeral should take place that night. His brother Dick had accompanied him, and they and his sister, with Mary and the children, and a couple of the neighbours, formed the humble cortege. Jack Everton said he would wait behind, on the chance of Tom Chuff coming in time, that he might tell him what had happened, and make him cross the moor with him to meet the funeral. His real object, I think, was to inflict upon the villain the drubbing he had so long wished to give him. Anyhow, he was resolved, by crossing the moor, to reach the churchyard in time to anticipate the arrival of the funeral, and to have a few words with the vicar, clerk, and sexton, all old friends of his, for the parish of Shackleton was the place of his birth and early recollections. But Tom Chuff did not appear at his house that night. In surly mood, and without a shilling in his pocket, he was making his way homeward. His bottle of gin, his last investment, half emptied, with its neck protruding, as usual on such returns, was in his coat pocket. His way home lay across the moor of Castian, and the point at which he best knew the passage was from the churchyard of Shackleton. He vaulted the low wall that forms its boundary, and strode across the graves and over many a flat, half-buried tombstone toward the side of the churchyard next Castian Moor. The old church of Shackleton and its tower rose, close at his right, like a black shadow against the sky. It was a moonless night, but clear. By this time he had reached the low boundary wall at the other side that overlooks the wide expanse of Castian Moor. He stood by one of the huge old beech trees, and leaned his back to its smooth trunk. Had he ever seen the sky look so black, and the stars shine out and blink so vividly? There was a death-like silence over the scene, like the hush that precedes thunder in sultry weather. The expanse before him was lost in utter blackness. A strange quaking unnerved his heart. It was the sky and scenery of his vision, the same horror and misgiving, the same invincible fear of venturing from the spot where he stood. He would have prayed if he dared. His sinking heart demanded a restorative of some sort, and he grasped the bottle in his coat pocket. Turning to his left as he did so, he saw the piled-up mould of an open grave that gaped with its head close to the base of the great tree against which he was leaning. He stood aghast. His dream was returning and slowly enveloping him. Everything he saw was weaving itself into the texture of his vision. The chill of horror stole over him. A faint whistle came shrill and clear over the moor, and he saw a figure approaching at a swinging trot with a zigzag course, hopping now here and now there, as men do over a surface where one has need to choose their steps. Through the jungle of reeds and bulrushes in the foreground this figure advanced, and with the same unaccountable impulse that had coerced him in his dream, he answered the whistle of the advancing figure. On that signal it directed its course straight toward him. It mounted the low wall, and standing there, looked into the graveyard. "Who med answer?" challenged the newcomer from his post of observation. "Me," answered Tom. "Who are you?" repeated the man upon the wall. "Tom Chuff." "And who's this grave cut for?" he answered in a savage tone, to cover the secret shudder of his panic. "I'll tell ye that, ye villain," answered the stranger, descending from the wall. "I ha' looked for you far and near, and waited long, and now you're found at last." Not knowing what to make of the figure that advanced upon him, Tom Chuff recoiled, stumbled, and fell backward into the open grave. He caught at the sides as he fell, but without retarding his fall. An hour later, when lights came with the coffin, the corpse of Tom Chuff was found at the bottom of the grave. He had fallen direct upon his head, and his neck was broken. His death must have been simultaneous with his fall. Thus far his dream was accomplished. It was his brother-in-law who had crossed the moor and approached the churchyard of Shackleton, exactly in the line which the image of his father had seemed to take in his strange vision. Fortunately for Jack Everton, the sexton and clerk of Shackleton Church were, unseen by him, crossing the churchyard toward the grave of Nelly Chuff, just as Tom the poacher stumbled and fell. Suspicion of direct violence would otherwise have inevitably attached to the exasperated brother. As it was, the catastrophe was followed by no legal consequences. The good vicar kept his word, and the grave of Tom Chuff is still pointed out by the old inhabitants of Shackleton pretty nearly in the centre of the churchyard. This conscientious compliance with the entreaty of the panic-stricken man as to the place of his sepulture gave a horrible and mocking emphasis to the strange combination by which fate had defeated his precaution and fixed the place of his death. The story was for many a year, and we believe still is, told round many a cottage hearth, and though it appeals to what many would term superstition, it yet sounded, in the ears of a rude and simple audience, a thrilling, and let us hope, not altogether fruitless homily. End of The Vision of Tom Chuff by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Read for you by Chiquito, Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. The Cobweb by H. Munro, a.k.a. Saki. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito, Crasto. The Cobweb by H. Munro. The farmhouse kitchen probably stood where it did as a matter of accident or haphazard choice. Yet its situation might have been planned by a master strategist in farmhouse architecture. Dairy and poultry yard, and herb garden, and all the busy places of the farm seemed to lead by easy access into its wide flagged haven, where there was room for everything, and where muddy boots left traces that were easily swept away. And yet, for all that, it stood so well in the centre of human hustle. Its long latticed window, with the wide window seat, built into an embrasure beyond the huge fireplace, looked out on a wild spreading view of hill and heather and wooden combe. The window nook made almost a little room in itself, quite the pleasantest room in the farm as far as situation and capabilities went. Young Mrs. Ladbruk, whose husband had just come into the farm by way of inheritance, cast covetous eyes on this snug corner, and her fingers itched to make it bright and cosy, with chintz curtains and bowls of flowers, and a shelf or two of old china. The musty farm parlour, looking out onto a prim, cheerless garden, imprisoned within high blank walls, was not a room that lent itself readily either to comfort or decoration. "When we are most settled, I shall work wonders in the way of making the kitchen habitable," said the young woman to her occasional visitors. There was an unspoken wish in those words, a wish which was unconfessed as well as unspoken. Emma Ladbruk was the mistress of the farm. Jointly with her husband, she might have her say, and to a certain extent her way, in ordering its affairs, but she was not mistress of the kitchen. On one of the shelves of an old dresser, in company with chipped sauce-boats, pewter jugs, cheese-graters, and paid bills, rested a worn and ragged Bible, on whose front page was a record, in faded ink, of a baptism dated 94 years ago. Martha Crale was the name written on that yellow page. The yellow, wrinkled old dame, who hobbled and muttered about the kitchen, looking like a dead autumn leaf, which the winter winds still pushed hither and thither, had once been Martha Crale. For 70-odd years she had been Martha Mountjoy. For longer than anyone could remember, she had pattered to and fro between oven and wash-house and dairy, and out to chicken run and garden, grumbling and muttering and scolding, but working unceasingly. Emma Ladbruk, of whose coming she took as little notice as she would of a bee wandering in at a window on a summer's day, used at first to watch her with a kind of frightened curiosity. She was so old and so much part of the place, it was difficult to think of her exactly as a living thing. Old Shep, the white-nozzled, stiff-limbed collie, waiting for his time to die, seemed almost more human than the withered, dried-up old woman. He had been a riotous, roistering puppy, mad with the joy of life, when she was already a tottering, hobbling dame. Now he was just a blind, breathing carcass, nothing more, and she still worked with frail energy, still swept and baked and washed, fetched and carried. If there was something in these wise old dogs that did not perish utterly with death, Emma used to think to herself, what generations of ghost dogs there must be out on those hills, that Martha had reared and fed and tended and spoken a last good-bye word to in that old kitchen. And what memories she must have of human generations that had passed away in her time. It was difficult for anyone, let alone a stranger like Emma, to get her to talk of the days that had been. Her shrill, quavering speech was of doors that had been left unfastened, pails that had got mislaid, calves whose feeding time was overdue, and the various little faults and lapses that checker a farmhouse routine. Now and again, when election time came round, she would unstore her recollections of the old names round which the fight had waged in the days gone by. There had been a Palmerston. There had been a name down Tiverton way. Tiverton was not a far journey as the crow flies, but to Martha it was almost a foreign country. Later there had been Northcotes and Acklands and many other newer names that she had forgotten. The names changed, but it was always Liberals and Tories, Yellows and Blues, and they always quarrelled and shouted as to who was right and who was wrong. The one they quarrelled about most was a fine old gentleman with an angry face. She had seen his picture on the walls. She had seen it on the floor too, with a rotten apple squashed over it, for the farm had changed its politics from time to time. Martha had never been on one side or the other. None of they had ever done the farm a stroke of good. Such was a sweeping verdict, given with all a peasant's distrust of the outside world. When the half-frightened curiosity had somewhat faded away, Emma Ladbruk was uncomfortably conscious of another feeling towards the old woman. She was a quaint old tradition, lingering about the place. She was part and parcel of the farm itself. She was something at once pathetic and picturesque, but she was dreadfully in the way. Emma had come to the farm full of plans for little reforms and improvements, in part the result of training in the newest ways and methods, in part the outcome of her own ideas and fancies. Reforms in the kitchen region, if those deaf old ears could have been induced to give them even a hearing, would have met with short shrift and scornful rejection, and the kitchen region spread over the zone of dairy and market businesses and half the work of the household. Emma, with the latest science of dead poultry dressing at her fingertips, sat by, an unheeded watcher, while old Martha trussed the chickens from the market stall as she had trussed them for nearly fourscore years, all leg and no breast, and the 100 hints about effective cleaning and labour lightening, and the things that make for wholesomeness which the young woman was ready to impart or to put into action, dropped away into nothingness before that wan, muttering, unheeding presence. Above all, the coveted window corner, that was to be a dainty, cheerful oasis in the gaunt old kitchen, stood now choked and lumbered with a litter of odds and ends that Emma, for all her nominal authority, would not have dared or cared to displace. Over them seemed to be spun the protection of something that was like a human cobweb. Decidedly, Martha was in the way. It would have been an unworthy meanness to have wished to see the span of that brave old life shortened by a few paltry months, but as the days sped by, Emma was conscious that the wish was there, disowned though it might be, lurking at the back of her mind. She felt the meanness of the wish come over her with a qualm of self-reproach one day, when she came into the kitchen and found an unaccustomed state of things in that usually busy quarter. Old Martha was not working. A basket of corn was on the floor by her side, and out in the yard the poultry were beginning to clamour a protest of overdue feeding time. But Martha sat huddled in a shrunken bunch on the window-seat, looking out with her dim old eyes, as though she saw something stranger than the autumn landscape. "Is anything the matter, Martha?" asked the young woman.
"'Tis death a-coming,"
answered the quavering voice.
"I knew 'twere coming, I knew it. 'Tweren't for nothing that old shep's been howling all morning. And last night I heard the screech owl give the death cry, and there was something white as run across the yard yesterday. 'Tweren't a cat nor a stoat, 'twere something. The fowls knew 'twere something. They all drew off to one side. Aye, there's been warnings. I knew it were a-coming."
The young woman's eyes clouded with pity. The old thing sitting there so white and shrunken had once been a merry, noisy child, playing about in lanes and haylofts and farmhouse garrets that had been 80-odd years ago, and now she was just a frail old body, cowering under the approaching chill of the death that was coming at last to take her. It was not probable that much could be done for her, but Emma hastened away to get assistance and counsel. Her husband, she knew, was down at a tree-felling some little distance off, but she might find some other intelligent soul who knew the old woman better than she did. The farm, she soon found out, had that faculty common to farmyards of swallowing up and losing its human population. The poultry followed her in interested fashion, and swine grunted interrogations at her from behind the bars of their sties, but barnyard and rickyard, orchard and stables and dairy gave no reward to her search. Then, as she retraced her step towards the kitchen, she came suddenly on her cousin, young Mr. Jim, as everyone called him, who divided his time between amateur horse-dealing, rabbit-shooting, and flirting with the farm-maids. "I'm afraid old Martha is dying," said Emma. Jim was not the sort of person to whom one had to break news gently. "Nonsense," he said. "Martha means to live to 100. She told me so, and she'll do it." "She may be actually dying at this moment, or it may just be the beginning of the break-up," persisted Emma, with a feeling of contempt for the slowness and dullness of the young man. A grin spread over his good-natured features. "It don't look like it," he said, nodding toward the yard. Emma turned to catch the meaning of his remark. Old Martha stood in the middle of a mob of poultry, scattering handfuls of grain around her. The turkey cock, with the bronzed sheen of his feathers and the purple red of his wattles, the game cock, with the glowing metallic lustre of his eastern plumage, the hens with their ochres and buffs and umbers and their scarlet combs, and the drakes with their bottle-green heads, made a medley of rich colour, in the centre of which the old woman looked like a withered stalk standing amid a riotous growth of gaily hued flowers. But she threw the grain deftly amid the wilderness of beaks, and her quavering voice carried as far as the two people who were watching her. She was still harping on the theme of death coming to the farm.
"I knew 'twere a-coming. There's been signs and warnings."
"Who's dead, then, old mother?" called out the young man.
"'Tis young Mr. Ladbruk," she shrilled back. "They've just carried his body in, run out of the way of a tree that was coming down, and ran himself onto an iron post. Dead when they picked him up. I knew 'twere coming."
And she turned to fling a handful of barley at a belated group of guinea fowl that came racing toward her. The farm was a family of property, and passed to the rabbit-shooting cousin as the next of kin. Emma Ladbruk drifted out of its history as a bee that had wandered in at an open window might flit its way out again. On a cold grey morning she stood waiting, with her boxes already stowed in the farm cart, till the last of the market produce should be ready, for the train she was to catch was of less importance than the chickens and butter and eggs that were to be offered for sale. From where she stood she could see an angle of the long latticed windows that was to have been cosy with curtains and gay with bowls of flowers. Into her mind came the thought that for months, perhaps for years, long after she had been utterly forgotten, a white, unheeding face would be seen peering out through those latticed panes, and a weak muttering voice would be heard quavering up and down those flagged passages. She made her way to a narrow based casement that opened into the farm larder. Old Martha was standing at a table, trussing a pair of chickens for the market stall, as she had trussed them for nearly 80 years. End of The Cobweb by H. Munro. Read for you by Chiquito, Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.